I'm in the business of wanting to resurrect that triumphant beast in you.
Welcome to the Boundless Body, the podcast with a somatic doctor interviewing innovative thinkers about their perspectives relating to the arts and sciences of therapy.
Expansion and contraction, that is the primary binary inside the construction of your body plan.
Dr. B is a voyager in trauma resolution who brings compassion and humor to the adventure of healing.
You study science enough and the bottom drops out and you're just like, oh.
Enchanting elements of science, philosophy, and art. Discover the Boundless Body here on this podcast.
Back to the mystery.
Okay, today we have a discussion with the two Brians here. Welcome, Brian, to the Boundless Body.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm just going to, yeah, of course. Yeah. So I'm just going to start off with a little intro and then we'll get rolling. So Brian Massumi is the author of numerous works across philosophy, political theory, and art theory. His publications include Couplets, Travels in Speculative Pragmatism, 99 Theses for the Revaluation of Value, and Parables for the Virtual Movement, Affect, Sensation. With Aaron Manning, who was on the first episode of this podcast, he works with the 3 Ecologies project, where he participates in the collective exploration of new ways of bringing philosophical and artistic practices into collaborative interaction. Welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So one of the things that I really admire about you, Brian, is that you had the ambition to translate Deleuze's great work, Capitalism and Schizophrenia, which is an extraordinary work. It's extraordinarily difficult, eccentric, and wonderful. And maybe if we could jump in a time machine and travel back to the 80s. It was the 80s that you translated this?
I started at the very beginning of the 80s, right after the book came out in French, which was 1980. Yes. So I started the project right about then, and it took until 1987 for it to be completed.
Extraordinary. Can you tell us a little bit about what that journey was like? This is an extraordinarily difficult work, and I imagine it was just so challenging to translate.
It was, especially in the pre-internet age, because they draw on materials from a wide range of disciplines, including various sciences. And now it took me, I spent an entire year just following up on their references in the library, but I could probably do that in a week now with the internet. So there's a steep learning curve just trying to understand the background they were drawing on before I could even start understanding what they were drawing it into. And that's really why I decided to translate the book. I had read some of their earlier, especially more political work, and it was startlingly different from what I was being exposed to in graduate school and what was dominant at the time. It had a very different approach that was more materialist, but redefining matter in a completely new way, where it's no longer in contradiction with mentality. I actually wrote to Deleuze to suggest translating another book called Difference in Repetition, which was part of his thesis. And it's also extremely difficult, but in a much more traditional sense. It's really working with the history of philosophy. This is his first big statement, moving out of that historical interpretive work into his own voice. And he wrote back and said, well, I've written this other book, which is much less academic, and I think is much better. Why don't you translate that one? It's just come out, co-authored with Félix Guattari. So that's what I did. And I hadn't translated before. So while I was waiting for that to be set up, I started translating other works to learn the trade. I did it because I thought a philosophy isn't just a set of ideas, a set of concepts that are somewhere floating in the world that you look at from a distance. You have to inhabit them. The writing is a kind of enactment of a philosophy. It puts you into a rhythm and a movement, and you have to start understanding how that moves you from within before you can truly understand the philosophy. And I felt that the best way of doing that for something as complicated as 1,000 Plateaus would be to actually translate it and make myself into a kind of ventriloquist of the authors. And I think that worked in some ways. It embedded this way of looking at the world and thinking, this rhythm and style of thinking in me that has become a kind of second nature, so that it's not something I go to, but it comes up through me. Everything I'm doing is sort of continuing the thinking that came to me through Deleuze and Guattari, with my own inflections and emphases and idiosyncratic obsessions.
I love this image, Brian the ventriloquist, the Deleuzian ventriloquist. I just love that. As the author lives inside of you, and you kind of graft yourself onto the author, and the author grafts themselves onto your body, and it becomes a living, breathing expression.
It's like a symbiosis
of the concept,
or a mutual parasitism.
Yeah.
And in this case, it's two authors. As they say, we wrote as a crowd from the very beginning, and so that also made a difference, because you can feel differences in the tenor of the concepts, the way they hold together and the way they move together. That shifts from one place to another in the book, and you're moving actually between voices. So you're ventriloquizing a crowd as you're translating that way, and you have to be sensitive to that variation. I think that helped me a lot in my own writing to be able to move into slightly different voices in my own writing.
Yeah, there's a shape-shifting quality to Deleuze and Guattari. They have a way of entering into the space of the authors that they cite, and have that ventriloquism embedded in their work too, where they have this unique way of embodying and entering into the world space and the life space of whoever it is that they're thinking with, which is just extraordinary and different and just unique to philosophy, right? So that it's not just abstraction. We'll talk more about abstraction and concrete and all that stuff later, but it's just an extraordinary type of embodiment that I think, and it might occur to some of the listeners that it's a bit of a stretch to say that Deleuze is a somatic psychologist. But to people like you and I, that just makes total sense, right? That it's all about the body.
It's definitely all about the body. But as you said, there's a real rule to abstraction that Deleuze and Guattari see that makes the concept of the body quite different from what we're used to.
Yeah. So, and by way of auguring down into the complexity, I'm wondering if we can talk about the unique understanding of the unconscious, that we see in Deleuze and Guattari. So one of the statements that they write about is that the unconscious is physics.
Mm-hmm.
The unconscious is physics, so that you have this really broad scope to the unconscious that, for me, I was interested in Jungian thought for quite some time. But when I ran into Deleuze and Guattari, my mind was blown and expanded to a whole new horizon. I'm wondering if you can kind of articulate and hash out for us Deleuze and Guattari's vision of the unconscious, and like how that might have strong implications for somatic folks like us.
Yeah, it's Guattari was a practicing analyst, and he was trained with Jacques Lacan. Deleuze was very influenced by Lacan in some of his earlier books. Their concept of the unconscious is in dialogue with psychoanalytic conceptions, but it's very different, and it tries to replace the psychoanalytic unconscious in a larger context. And when they say that it's a kind of physics, what they're saying is that the unconscious is not a set of representations. Because if you think of it as a set of representations of symbolic associations, semantic associations, you're sort of back-forming the unconscious with sort of notions of what it means to think that really come out of our conscious experience. From the linguistic level, it's opened up, it's open to condensations and displacements, but it's still basically symbolic in a way that's not only recognizable in relation to how we think about symbol and representation in our everyday waking and conscious lives. So when they say that it's a physics, what they're saying is that it's actually doing something, that it's productive. Sometimes they compare it to a factory. And what they mean by that is that there's a kind of continual background churning where the life of the body, at the point where it is just generating the first glimmers of thought, is in touch with a whole range of different tendencies, and the tendencies are attracted to certain qualities or move in certain directions, that they're sort of vectorized. So it's a kind of vector field where what is being connected to are virtualities, in other words, potentials for things that might eventuate, things that might emerge. So they think of the unconscious as the field of emergence of action, conscious perception, and conscious thought, and that it's the beginnings, the incipiencies of all of those, but coming together in germ before they're separated out into what you call a separate perception, a separate semantically formed thought, and things like that. They also say that because of that, the unconscious is not enclosed in the family circle, and it doesn't only play itself out in relation to certain privileged symbolic figures in that circle, like the mother and the father, that is actually always leaking on all sides. And that it's this amazing machine for making connections that create potential movements that can leak out in all directions. So a child connecting to a toy, they wouldn't necessarily be replaying the scenes or issues that come from relationships with people within the family sphere, but they're connecting with the qualities of movement, the experiential qualities of being connected to that object, the worlds that can be conjured into existence in a way that's fabulatory, but not necessarily symbolic. The difference being that fabulation is creative and creates novel situations and even novel aims.
Yeah, so it's like this engine of novelty. I really like this phrase motorless motor, because there's this sense where they call it the machinic unconscious in the mechanistic sense, where we're just cogs in a machine and everything's all objective or whatever, but it's this miracle making machine. It's generating novelties, it's producing, and the universe itself is like an organless organ that just produces novelties and generates conflicts and generates symmetries and breaks symmetries. Each moment, for example, the moment that we're in right now, is a nexus of forces. Each moment is a nexus of these vectors that you're talking about, where there's all sorts of possibilities for novelty. And that's one of the things that I really love about this model, because what it means is that it's a model of enthusiasm. It's a model of that really nurtures innovation.
Definitely, yeah. It definitely is based on a kind of enthusiasm, not of a subject toward the world, because this is at a level at which the subject is just forming and isn't there fully, but it's enthusiasm of the world moving through a body. And that exuberance is an exuberance to make connections, and each connection is creating another connection in a web of potential movements and thoughts and perceptions. So what it is a relation generating machine, and it's driven not by symbolic connections or representational thoughts that occur subliminally. It's motored by affect. It's motored by a sense of aliveness and the qualities of life that can be had by making those connections, by following those paths, by exploring potentials that itching in your relationship to the world, but haven't quite expressed themselves. And you want to find a way to scratch them out of that experience of what that's like. So it's extremely exploratory, extremely exuberant, but it's not all positivity and fun. And that's the other thing about it. There's a misunderstanding of Deleuze and Guattari that when they talk about affirmation, which is the idea that that the unconscious isn't a set of blockages to be overcome, but this exuberant productivity and interconnectivity, that when they talk about that, they're always giving warnings that there is a kind of negativity built into it, because as soon as you make a connection and you connect connections into a kind of system, you're creating what they think of as an organized body, a body whose parts and affects and potentials for movement and thought connect together into a certain way and create certain pathways that are like circuits that it continually moves along. And that brings out many other potentials, because you can build on top of that a lot of operations, a lot of functions. You can bring parts of the world into clarity that weren't as clear before by following those pathways. But it also cuts down, it limits the potential, because now you're channeled into certain pathways. And part of the exuberance, the affirmation of the affirmativity of the unconscious, is that it rebels against that. So there's a kind of pushback or negation of being limited in that organismic way that can create a lot of pain, a lot of conflict. It can lead to a lot of difficulties in life, because it's basically what they call the body without organs, the body in its reach for continually shifting exploration and potentials, conflict between that and the body that with its organs and functions that allows actually the physical body to live, but limits that exploration. So the body is a bit at war in itself. But instead of just saying that's a contradiction and leaving it at that, or instead of moving into it as a kind of black hole, although it can become that, they say that it's part of a process. This is a pulse in process. There's a moving out, making of connections, exploration of potential, and then that starts to set in, basically to institutionalize itself. And then the body without organs, the body in its affirmative exuberance rebels, and there's a hiatus, a suspension. Everything stops, goes back to ground zero. The intensity of affect goes down to what they call degree zero of intensity. And then things can start again. It's a way of putting a little cut in that allows a refreshment and a reorientation, and makes it so that things don't set into place in a kind of ossified way. And that's what they call the skits, that cut. So people misunderstand a lot and think it's all about the continuity of this flow into different pathways and making into different connections and this continually expanding universe of potential. But it's actually something where cut is as important, if not more important, than the continuity. And so their notion of analysis is not interpreting what's going on according to a sort of a framework of associations and other sort of semantic and other connections, but it's how to inflect the cuts, how to modulate the cuts, how to make the cuts. So it's very pragmatic. And then their point is that you can't do that by yourself, because the body is never alone. It's always in the act of making those connections and moving into the world and moving the world through it in its movement out toward it, this kind of infolding, outfolding movement, so that there's a necessity to connect to other people, so that the analysis has to be collective and an active analysis through others in situation, in a kind of experimental practice of tweaking each other's sketches, teaching others cuts, and together creating what they think of as a machine that functions trans-individually, taking them up in a direction that no one person would have been able to go by themselves, creating a kind of surplus or surplus value of potential and organization through it. So it's one's bodily and political way of looking at things.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm thinking about one of the differences that is very intriguing and powerful in this way of looking at the unconscious is the understanding of chaos. And that chaos is a primordial producer. It's not just chaos isn't in Deleuze and Guattari, it's not an image of destruction just by itself. Chaos itself is productive, that there's something fundamentally creative, and that chaos is central to the dynamics in the unconscious, and that these Freudian attempts and Jungian attempts and different folks that are trying to map what's happening in the unconscious, they tend to kind of polarize. In the case of Jung, there's these archetypal structures. We look at the collective unconscious and we look at mythological images and we're looking for deep structures. And Freud has his topology where we're looking at the superego, which is a structure that does all these moralisms and moral rules and stuff like that. But with Deleuze and Guattari, it's like, no, chaos is fundamental and it's also fundamentally productive. And there's rhythms baked into chaos in the unconscious. Right now, you and I are in the egg of chaos. You know, there's all sorts of possible directions that we could take this conversation. Both of us are drawing from a load of intellectual and embodied experiences. And all of it is in the egg churning and churning and churning. And yeah, there's elements of structure. Deleuze had a Jungian era of his writing where he's kind of looking, he's like, oh yeah, there's something to this structure stuff. There's some rhythm, there's some order. But I think a fundamental difference is the lifting up of chaos as a productive space.
Exactly. Psychoanalytic interpretations tend to operate with a closed system. I never practiced psychoanalysis, but I did. I went through a period of really working on psychoanalytic literary theory. It can be extremely complex, extremely fun to do, very, very interesting. But I realized I was finding the same things over and over again because it's structured and because the conflicts are sort of baked into the structure. So you can add details from an individual life to it, but you're still reenacting the structure. Chaos is what opens the system for Deleuze and Guattari. I think their concept of chaos, it has a lot of sources going all the way back to antiquity and Lucretius. But it's also very much in dialogue with modern physics and the way the quantum void is described. The quantum void is not empty, it's actually overfull. What it's empty of is fully formed particles and molecules and objects. What it's full of are what they call virtual particles, which are particles that pop into existence and then no sooner subside into this sort of roiling rhythm of coming out and falling back in. They think of the unconscious in a similar way, where that chaotic void is full of the churning and rechurning of potential. And something in relation with other actions and with other people and objects, things are selected into actualizing and coming fully formed, the way the detection of the particles in quantum physics fixes a particle in a certain set of characteristics. But the analogy only goes so far, because there's also, like you said, there are rhythms and even structures or bits of structure in that chaos. And that's because there's a kind of feedback where what has emerged and taken fully form feeds back to that level where it is disaggregated to a certain extent, but really repotentialized. So that chaos is never just a simple tabula rasa or raw state of experience or foundation of experience. It's like a turning point where everything is repotentialized, re-virtualized in order to emerge again. So that injects a bit of a political notion into even chaos as it relates to the unconscious, because the way those remnants of what has emerged feed back can orient the next emergence so that there's a kind of continual modulation in which that is held within certain parameters by social structures, by disciplinary mechanisms, by a body's own relation to itself, and turning away from some of the affirmative exuberance that characterizes it. Then it can have very normative or even oppressive effects.
Yeah. So what we're looking at here is how structure is incubated in
Exactly.
chaos. One of the images that Deleuze and Guattari use a lot is the cosmic
Right.
egg. That there's something in the universe that that incubates structure, and one of the things that I love about their work is one of the sciences they draw from is the science of
Right.
embryology, which I have a deep passion for. I've been an
Oh,
embryologist, or kind of layperson embryologist for about 20 years now. In embryology, when a fetus is being created, when our body plan is getting generated, what Deleuze and Guattari are saying is that that chaos is there as a productive organ that essentially secretes novelties, like the novelties of body plans, and that all that chaos has got to be funneled into a structure and an ordered body plan and stuff like that. But so that's in the infrastructure. Chaos is in the infrastructure,
exactly.
and we have the embryo being woven together as a structure, and so what they're saying is baked into our body plans, that how our body is created, it comes from this egg of chaos. But then once we get into structure, similar to how a cell, once it starts to differentiate, right? Once a cell starts to differentiate, there's kind of no way of going back. But meanwhile, and that's akin to some of these ways of thinking, like the Freudian ways and the Jungian ways of thinking, and a lot of the cultural theories and stuff like that. That there's an always already structure that is imposed upon experience. Like, then we just keep on going back to structure and structure and structure. Oh, that must be your mother complex. Oh, that must be your attachment stuff. Oh, that must come from your family of origin or your society of origin. What Deleuze and Guattari are saying is that underneath all of those structures is this productive chaos that the structure can then tend to wall off, and that we can lose touch with that, which is a tragedy to them. They're basically saying that we're kind of in a prison in many ways, in a lot of these structured ways of thinking.
Yeah, another way of saying it is that their philosophy is a philosophy of structuration. So structure isn't given in advance and imposed on a body like a mold that forces it into a pre-given form. Structuration emerges. And if it emerges, you have to say it emerges from something that's not yet it. Otherwise, you're in a closed loop. You're in a vicious circle where you're presupposing what you're deriving. So what structuration comes out of is a chaotic field of emergence. And in embryology, the concept of the field is very central. There are no organs yet. There's no structures, but there's a field that has rhythms of a cell movement. It has polarities, just like the polarities in the magnetic field. It has gradients of chemicals, and among those chemicals are inductors that tweak the process in certain directions. And the field starts to take shapes through the tension, the way that that differential field, the elements of it relate to each other. And it's filtered or channeled in certain directions, but each time an advance is made, it, like you say, it's cutting off, moving back. It's a decision. It's a kind of fate that has befallen the embryo, and it's on a pathway. And there's still a lot of margin for play, and there's still a certain amount of indeterminacy, but the indeterminacy, the body plan, becomes more and more constrained and defined. But it's moving toward birth, where that structuration will allow the process to continue in a different way through physical maturation and through psychic growth and change. And there's an individuation of the body that's continued by a psychic individuation. And it's the same principle of productive, chaotic field that's full of gradients, rhythms, polarities that sustains an ongoing structuration.
I love talking with you, Brian. I'm thinking about all these things. This is field theory, and field theory is present in the therapeutic arts and sciences. Like, for example, and there's a whole continuum from the scientific frameworks where they're looking at morphogenetic fields in the embryo to, like, for example, the really mystical approaches in the therapeutic arts, such as family constellations therapy, where they're talking about the knowing field. And so you have this big gradient from the sciences to the kind of mystical. And I like to go with Deleuze and Guattari. Like the truth is in the middle. On the mystical side of things, there can be too much of this fallacy of misplaced concreteness that Whitehead talks about, like confusing the abstract for the concrete, which can be a problem. We'll talk about that. But one of the things that I really love about drawing from the science side, we can find through science a kind of middling zone. And that middling zone is topology.
Exactly.
Which I was just reviewing your literature recently, and I did a Control F function and put in the word topology, and there was like 300 hits or something like that. And I'm like, okay, this guy's a topology guy. I want to talk to a topology guy, because I'm a topology guy too. And the embryo is topological.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, have you ever met Manuel Delanda?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I'm wondering if I could throw down a quote from him. It's a quote talking about the embryo and how cells differentiate in the embryo. And what he's doing is he's saying that there's a field, okay? There's a field that shapes the embryo, and then there's fields within fields. And then he's talking about the differentiation process. And then I think later we can continue to take this in the direction of what that means in the field of a relationship, like us, a relational field or a clinical relationship, but also to frame, kind of give a little bit more of this middle space, this topological space for what's happening in a group and a society.
Yeah.
So are you cool if I throw down?
Yes.
Throw down this
I'm
Delanda
not a
quote?
mathematician.
Okay.
I've been obsessed with topology from afar for a long time. There's a lot in what you just said. I wanted to go back for a second and talk about field theory. Field theory it's in the sciences. It also has a history in psychology. In psychology, field theory was the ones that I know of were influenced by Gestalt theory. So that the relational field was inhabited by was sort of moved by a principle of homeostasis and basically a movement toward, basically an entropic movement, and a kind of finding a metastability within the chaos and prolonging that. And what Deleuze and Guattari do is add a negentropic element of this creative chaos that's constantly underlying every moment and every action and reopening it to a field of potential so that it is obliged not just to continue in the same form, but to modify its form as it continues. And if it's going to stay as close as possible to its own form, it has to create or fall into mechanisms that hold the variation within limits. So it's a philosophy of variation coming first and being limited rather than structure coming first and enabling variation within normative boundaries. And again, that has political implications in the way we live our everyday lives. Topology is interesting because it's a very different sense of space and of form. A topological form isn't one thing. It's a series of transformations. So it's a series of transformations within certain parameters or within certain limits. And it has to do with foldings and stretchings, foldings in, foldings out, stretchings. If there's a cut made, the topological figure is cut and you fall into another topological figure. So it's very similar to what we were talking about before in relation to the cut into a relational field that's folding in, folding out, and has rhythms where the different parts are moving toward and through each other in ways that suggest new potentials. So the topological figure is a continual variation of a form. So the figure is an infinite multiplicity of all the forms that it passes through in that. So the classic example is a tire or shape or a torus. And if you twist it and stretch it, you get a coffee cup. So you have two completely different forms, a tire and a coffee cup, that are actually the same figure. They're the same dynamic form. So it's a concept of dynamic form that takes precedence over the usual sense of separate discrete forms. Separate discrete forms are extracted from that dynamic form, from the continuity of it by cuts. And then you have to ask, what makes the cut if we're talking about this in terms of our own lives? And what are the effects of that? Okay, I'm not sure if there are other points you made that I was going to address.
Yes, it's fundamentally a tensor field where there's tensions that are relating to each other. You had discussed that, there's some psychologists that think about social fields as fields of distributed tension. And now Kurt Lewin is one of the wondrous authors that was looking at social fields as psychological fields of tension. And he basically wasn't saying this isn't just abstract stuff. This stuff is real. There's real tensions that are happening within the psyche. There's real tensions that are happening in the social fabric of things that literally tug on us. And that there's a different space of measurement that is needed than the classical sciences. So I have, so for Lewin, so this comes from Lewin, this following quote, human bodies are situated in socio-psychological fields, relational webs of tension that are empirical, but not measurable by any classical means of measurement. He called this web of relations life space, defined as the total of possible and not possible ways of behaving.
Beautiful.
Pretty good, huh?
Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, and this sensibility is deeply in your work. It's deeply in the work of Deleuze and Guattari. And as I articulate Visionary Somatics, which is my book, that's the fundamental. It's difficult stuff to wrap your mind around. And it sounds, the weird thing is it sounds abstract, but it's not. Maybe we can talk for a second about abstract and concrete and how we get muddled by the distinction between abstract and concrete.
Oh, it's hard because you say so many things I want to respond to before you come to the question. And I forget the question, so I'm going to maybe do that again. But I'm going upstream to talk about about tension.
Okay.
And
All
I
right.
love that you brought the notion of tensor to it, because a tension, if you add the concept of a tensor to it, you have a directionality, you have an orientation, it's something in movement, and it has a certain orientation to that movement. So you're talking about tendencies. So if you think of the constitutive tensions as tendencies, then you have these embryonic movements that are potentially moving to a certain direction, but they're constantly being activated en masse, and they don't necessarily all move in the same direction. They might be able to combine forces and create a kind of resultant tensor that moves in a slightly different direction. They could be collectively creative in that way. They can also clash. All of the tendencies and the ideas of the relational field in Deleuze and Guattari is that all of the tendencies are always being reactivated at every moment, but in a graded fashion where, because of the context, a lot of them are less available for becoming fully formed and being actualized and acted out than others. So there's a background of unactualized tendencies, tensions, potentials. So that's why in the Lewin quote, he had to say, including what is not happening. What's not happening but could potentially be happening is as important as what is starting to structure itself into a determinate happening. So that's one of the ways of getting to the idea of abstraction, because if every moment is surrounded by a kind of halo of unactualized tendencies that are still in some way contributing to the overall field of tensions, then what is not actually present and fully active still has a reality and an effect, because it's just the fact of it not being selected for actualization is structuring the field. It's a kind of choice of the field and not to go that way. And that choice not to go that way is inscribed in the way that it did go. So the basic definition of abstraction that I work with is the effective presence of what is not there, what is not actually there. And that all of those paths not taken but that could be taken are part of what that is. Another way is, if you think of a tendency, first of all, they're self-triggering, like a habit. When you talk about your own tendencies, it's not you making them happen, it's them inhabiting your happenings. And so they have that self-triggering power of the habit. And like a habit, they're oriented, but they're much more open-ended than a habit, because they can be inflected along the way by what other tendencies they meet, or what obstacles they meet, or what affordances they come to, so that there's an orientation toward which you'd think of as an intentionality, but it's not a conscious intentionality on the human reflective level, but it's an occurrent intentionality within the working out of a relational field. Whitehead calls that the aim of a process, or of a part of process. That aim is abstract because it's not there yet, but it's forming the trajectory to it by the way in which it attracts what's underway toward actualizing in its direction. So it's a real retrospective, retroductive efficacy. It's acting, but it's not real in the sense of a fully formed, discrete, empirically measurable object. It's real in the way that potential is real. It's virtual. It's a virtual reality. So thought at the most basic level is the body's actions and perceptions orienting themselves to these virtualities. And that's happening at every level. It's not only happening at the level of our conscious reflection, it's happening at many non-conscious levels, happening at the level of our bodies and in our organs, because our organs are continually regenerating themselves and dealing with novel inputs and adjusting. And the idea is that if orienting toward the abstract or enacting the abstract, the definition of thought, and the abstract has to do, in one of its figures, with this movement toward aims that are effectively oriented but not yet there, then the body, as it's in its physiological level, is thinking through its life as it heals a wound with a scar that will be different from every other scar that it makes, that regulates its endocrine functions in relation to stress events. So the idea is that there's a kind of margin of maneuver because of that chaotic relational field that even at the physiological level creates a certain possibilities for novelty to occur, and that the physical, as opposed to the mental in Whitehead's sense, is defined as events channeling themselves as much as possible as a repetition along the same lines of what came before, the way a billiard ball hits another billiard ball and that billiard ball goes in the same direction. So it's a kind of conformation of action along a pre-existing momentum with enacting a similar structure. But mentality is taking advantage of creative chaos to produce variations on that. And what parameters of its variations remain in is what determines whether we say, well, it's the same thing, but it's changed a little bit, or this thing is becoming, and it's qualitatively changing, and it's on a journey of individuation where what it will become is not yet played out. And that's sort of the base state. In the more limited form, continuing along the main lines, replaying the same structure, is actually a limit case of that. So it's that same turning things on its head that they often do, where structure and form is generated and then has a regulative function rather than coming before having a founding function.
Yeah, so there's a universal field that has chaotic elements that produces structures. There's a field of habits. There's a field of tensions. And all of these fields are in relationship with each other. And there's all sorts of tugging and then we could say that there's a field of escape of some kind that's always trying to escape structure. And I think that's one of the brilliant aspects, right? Because I want to provide an example. So like in the field of somatic psychology, one of the habits is to continually capture lines of flight, lines of escape that would escape towards processes of intellectualization and imagination and bring it back into just the sensory readout of the body. So and there can be this anti-intellectual element in the somatics community that is constantly capturing the flight into the radical egg of chaos, into the radical egg of imagination and abstraction, and the realm, and in short, the realm of the virtual potentials where there's chaos and when there's new possibility and innovation. And it's not just in somatics, of course. This is where we see we run into this everywhere, where there's all sorts of churning possibilities and lines of escape from the structured ways of interpreting and making meaning, and it gets captured, right? Continually captured by various structures. And it's one of the things that I'm very passionate about in somatic psychology is, listen, anti-intellectualism isn't going to work. We need to partner thinking and affective intensities and all these churning possibilities and intensities in the body with thought. And one of the unique things about Deleuze and Guattari, of course, and you and your work is that thinking isn't separate. It's distinct. It's distinct and
Exactly.
It's not separate.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of semantic practices, the structure that captures is the self. Things are brought back to the self. and the bodily feelings that are associated with or compose the self. And from a Deleuzean perspective, you apply the same operation to the self as you did to structure, and say that there's a selfing, just as there is a structuration, but the self isn't a form that comes first and molds everything. And it's not closed in on itself. It's constantly broken into by the chaos. It's constantly regenerating itself out of a field of this embryonic field of emergence. And a lot can happen in terms of variation within that. That concept of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness from Whitehead that you mentioned is really, really important, because what it says is that things that we take to be concrete actually have a very large measure of abstraction built into their constitutions. So if you think of an object as the most discrete, concrete thing you can think of, like a coffee cup that isn't in a topological transformation, yeah. We think of that as something given in its form, as if the form is simply there and we apprehend the form. But actually, we're seeing that because of an extremely complex collaboration between our senses that we have trained, or that has emerged towards form detection. A neonate baby does not see objects. It directly sees that relational field you're talking about. It sees variations of color moving into illumination, every vision coming with synesthetic hints of other sense experience like touch. It's according to Daniel Stern in his neonate studies, what they're perceiving is directly a field of intensities in continual variation. And that's what's given to us. There's no fixity in illumination. It's constantly shifting. Our eyes are adding shift by the saccadic movements. They're constantly adding jitter because they're not focusing on something given. They're jittering across edges in order to regenerate a form using the by now ingrained perceptual habits of form detection. So that object is highly abstract if you look at it a certain way. When we see it, we are experiencing a potential touch, a relay to a sense that isn't activated in relation to it. Therefore, it is acting, but not yet actuated, not yet there. We're projecting one sense into another. Our past touches of object, understanding of edge, understanding of texture, is part of what makes the sight function as a stable presentation of an object. So we are literally seeing touch in vision when we see an object. So it's a highly abstract construct within a pragmatic field that gives it a function. Because it's given a function, we think of it as just there for our functional use, given to us, and then we do with it what we wish. But the point is that everything in our lives has emerged in that way, and we're living through those emergences, and they're in our orientations of the world and our awareness and our body functions. They're not simply something presenting itself from the outside to our perception. So that means that seeing an object is a form of thought. It's a form of abstraction that marshals the senses. And the senses, they're never simply channels for the reception of sense impressions. They're always already in relation to each other, synthesizing among themselves to create a kind of surplus value of perception, an excess over of what is given. That's the organization, functionalization of something that allows us to recognize it and use it. But we can also look at it anew and see all of the shimmerings and variations, see all the other potentials that the function cuts out, and then we're in the domain of art.
Yeah. So synesthesia, there's a term called primary synesthesia. Just to define for the listeners what synesthesia is, it's a blending of the senses. People that have the condition called synesthesia or the skill. One can smell colors, for example, where we see these mixing of sensory modalities. And there's a theory called primary synesthesia, and which is what is one way of labeling what
Right.
you've described, that when we're infants, it's a natural, undifferentiated way of
Or
experiencing. The key word there is
hyper-differentiated, actually. More
undifferentiated.
differentiated than, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's interesting.
That's what Daniel
Hyper-differentiated.
Stern
Say
says,
that.
yeah.
Say
Because it,
yeah. Okay. Well, talk
well,
more
it's just
about
like we
those.
tend to think of
Yeah.
chaos as more as simpler than structure, but it's actually much more complicated because it has all of those germinal structures and rhythms within it that become any number of other structures, just like the embryological field in the egg. So, from Daniel Stern's point of view, that this is a hyper-differentiated field where we haven't yet reduced all the differences and tensions into taking actionable form in the perception of a separate object. And that's the primary synesthesia of the innocent, but it's also an underlying layer that is the field of emergence of our perception and experience. It's an underlying layer that follows us throughout life and that we're constantly redrawing our structures out of, but we're using it also to refresh them so that we can change direction, adapt, invent new pathways. There's a notion of synesthesia. It's often talked about as cross-modal relay. A number will have a color, or a color will have a sound, and there's this connection between two senses. That's a more structured and limited form of synesthesia than the primary synesthesia that you were invoking. And it raises a question that goes right to the heart of abstraction, because the question is, if there's a cross-modal relay, what's in between? And it has to be amodal. It's not in vision and it's not in touch. It's a relationality. And it's a potentializing of two different things, but obviously more. There are more senses than that, and they're always involved in one way or another. So that amodality is an abstraction of perception, in perception of the body, that allows our perceptions to grow, but is not in one sense or another, doesn't have anything particular corresponding to it in terms of incoming stimulus. It's a relational emergence. It's what I call a lived abstraction. So lived abstraction is at the heart of everything we perceive. So trying to separate out the concrete from the abstract is self-defeating, because you're editing out what actually allowed us to create the structures we're living in, and feeds us the potential to modify them or escape them, as you were saying.
Brilliant. So there's a hidden abstraction inside the apparently concrete.
Exactly.
When you talk about hyper differentiation, I'm thinking about the work of Gilbert Simondon. I'm anglicizing it. I don't know how you say his name in French, but you know what I'm talking about, right? Where he was just in love with embryology too. And the way that you're speaking about hyper differentiation is that he's basically saying that there's a blueprint of differentiated structures that is there before the structures.
Exactly.
The field itself is already differentiated. And so that maps onto what you're saying.
Exactly. Yeah. Simondon is very, very close to this. And once Deleuze drew a lot from Simondon. The fact that we know of his work today is mainly due to Deleuze and his drawing on the work. And Simondon's, one of his main concepts was the concept of the pre-individual. And the pre-individual is precisely a field of tension. So he says that there are always tensions at play, and he says there's a difference in magnitude between the tensions. So there could be a tension like a physical state of comfort or discomfort, and then a semantic field of what's going on in a social interaction. Those are on completely different levels. There's a difference in magnitude between them. And there could be something that doesn't quite work between them that you have to work out. So that the tension has to collapse or resolve itself into a new action that resolves the tension temporarily, but creatively in a next thought or next step or next word. So he's always talking about pre-individual fields, and then this sort of emergence of form out of the tension, structuring those fields. And when the tensions of different magnitudes belonging to different fields, basically, connect in the way that creates a joint tension or something that creates a difficulty or an obstacle or just gives pause. And then there's this triggering of an emergence. That's what he calls communication. And the difference that emerges, he calls information. And what's really interesting about that is that it's a completely non-mediated notion of communication and information. It's not usually we think of communication as mediating our thinking through the conveyance of information from one place to another. This is an event. This is happening in situation. It has to do with the relationality working itself out, tension creating something new out of its own initial irresolvability. He was very interested in embryology. He was interested in technologies of all kinds. And his main point is that the emerged does not resemble its conditions of emergence. And that's a warning to say, don't study something that's fully constituted, already formed, and you understand already as a form, and then back project its characteristics into what it came from. The field of emergence is precisely where it was not yet there. So you have to find incipiencies, potentials for it to emerge, rather than finding its characteristics in the field of potential. So that completely opens up thought, and it does make it more abstract.
Yeah, similar to how this pre-individual force that Simondon is talking about that is differentiated already and then driving tissue production in an embryo. I'm thinking about primary synesthesia in the individual baby, but I'm also thinking about primary synesthesia at the origins of language and at the origins of human meaning-making practices, where you can think about civilization, you can think about the pre-language human, okay, as a kind of undifferentiated embryo. But the thing is that there's a force that's already driving it towards language and towards differentiation. So I'm wondering if you can talk about how this pre-individual force cuts up once we this primary synesthesia is cut up into language codes, ritual practices, talking about kinship systems, and how basically the social body gets cut up into organs.
Yeah, well, I know you spoke with Erin Manny a while back, and she's written a lot about these issues in relation to autism and what she calls autistic perception, which is a similar concept to primary synesthesia, but in relation to autism, similarly structured. And she talks about how autists always talk about chunking. I don't know if she talked about it in her interview, but they talk about how when you walk into a room and you're neurotypical, meaning that you're operating in these functional habits that have been set within certain normative parameters that society advances, that everything automatically falls into place as objects with known affordances. It chunks into a chair you can sit on, a table you can eat your breakfast on. And that moment of chaos when a field is coming into formation is simply overlooked because it happens on the microsecond level. As an autist, it can take 5 minutes. So they are living in that primary synesthesia and in that relational field. What's one of the interesting things about autism is that for autists who take a long time to come to language use, especially autists who can't use their mouths to speak, when they come to language basically in poetry. And that is reflecting that moving field of relation and trying to bring it into language. And that indicates that what language is normally doing is just trying to make like a one-to-one correspondence between a word and an object, or a word and a function, without going back to the relational field and seeing how it tinges our experience of objects and functions, and how there's still within that perception lines that escape back toward the relational field. So language is in a way a parasite upon our body's construction of referential language, not all language, on our body's constructions of objects that I was just talking about. And it brackets that whole process. It brackets the synesthesia. It brackets its primariness. It brackets the relational field, the tensions. And it's telling you, you don't have to worry about that. All you have to do is look at the object as if it was already there, and then connect to it according to your intentions and your needs and your functions. So it's taking basically what is a derivative of a very complex hyperdifferentiated field and indexing your attention, your actions to that little point. So it's limiting in that way, which has amazing potential. It's the basis of all science and all technology, but it's not the end all and be all of experience. So language can also operate differently by playing with the fringes of words, with the ambiguities of words, with the rhythms of words. And it can move back from the edges, the margins of indeterminacy of objects, the margins of indeterminacy around them, to the relational field, and index you to that complexity rather than indexing you to the simplicity of the object that has been constructed out of it. So language, for me, is not the enemy, but a certain usage of language is a partial enemy, an enemy to the extent that it tries to channel you away from other uses that would be evoking and indexing you to that greater complexity. When it does that, it's not holding all that complexity in meaning, because meaning is too structured and too limited for it, because it can't grasp all of those untaken paths, the tensions that are there but not expressed, the potentials that have not yet fully formed. All of that is churning around, is roiling around language use. So what it can do is put your body back in the state where it re-experiences, and that's a performative function. It's doing something. So it can cut across the functional use of language in a skits of the kind we were talking about before, and index you to that complexity in a way that the feeling of it wells back up through you, and you become in some way aware of it, even if it's only a kind of side perception, even if it's only a tonality and an atmosphere or an affective tonality. But those atmospheres, those affective tonalities envelop that huge complexity with all these different sub-qualities and the feelings associated with different tendencies. And all of that can, in a way, present itself, but not explicitly. It presents itself where the bulk of it is enveloped so that it's an expressive function. It's expressing something that it's not saying directly. And that also is a kind of performative. But on the other hand, language can perform in ways that are extremely disciplinary or norm enforcing. And that's a function of language that Deleuze and Guattari call the order word. Because of the social structuring that is a part of our lives, the order word is always a dimension of language that's present. So when they say something as simple as someone says, pass the salt, it's not meaning there's salt there, I want you to pass it. It's saying there's this whole relational field. Society has structured it in this way with certain practices of taste, certain practices of hospitality and generosity. And passing the salt means you're going to act in accordance with that implicit field of presupposition. So what language is doing is accessing fields of presupposition rather than just operating on an explicit level of language. So they say that the explicit level of language in that performative use of language is just the minimum condition for the performance to occur, for the order word to have its effect. So if you say fire and shout fire, it's very different from shouting for, like on a golf course. There's one little phoneme that's different, but the pragmatic situation and the implicit presuppositions built into that situations are completely different. And what the language does is cue you into an action in that presuppositional field that's orienting what you're doing and giving meaning to it in the sense that it's saying what's important. It's conveying import that you feel immediately in your body. You don't have to pause to think about it. It immediately braces you into the situation. If someone yells fire, you don't stop and think about it. You run for water. And you're not thinking when you do that. Your body's thinking when you do that. And that's because it's thinking out a relational field, rather than thinking about things.
Nice. So I'm thinking about what I'm seeing as an obsession in the social body. We're talking essentially about the birth of language and the function of language, primary synesthesia. And you mentioned the order word, and I think this is a very powerful and important concept. I think that there's been a primordial terror and is a primordial terror in the social body against chaos or about chaos, and that the ancient ritual practices, the indigenous ritual practices, in many ways converge on creating structures, ritual structures to ward off chaos. And ritual structures, by nature of the fact of being structures, are ordering and often have words and names for deities and things like that. And this is one way of thinking about how the social body got differentiated, is along different lines of warding off chaos.
Exactly. Yeah. And by warding off chaos, it's also, in a sense, warding off potential. And then social systems have to find ways of reinscribing the potential. So in indigenous cultures, there are often ritual practices that cyclically regenerate the order of the world. But at the same time, those practices are not just myths that are stories that are told that are just there to have the meaning conveyed and make you think about it. They're built into social practices and social practices of learning as you grow older. And they're constantly being used as ways of rethinking things collectively. It's like a collective set of touchstone that is being reprocessed through social relationality and creates new variations on itself. Myths aren't set, there aren't myths in the usual sense that we think about in Western culture. Those oral traditions aren't set in stone once and for all. They evolve. So among Australian Indigenous people, there are what we would call myths from their dream time that refer to historical events from a century ago. So it's a living, expanding body of knowledge practice that has to be lived out in relation to the individual body and lived out in relation to the land. That's the way that warding off of chaos is able to integrate thinking through of potential on the collective and active level. And every society has to have something like that, or it ossifies and becomes a caricature of itself and eventually dies. Something has to give at a certain point. So we're in a situation today where those concerns about warding off chaos have become more and more pointed because the world itself is becoming more chaotic, especially since the outbreak of concern about terrorism. But before that, all of the rhetoric about the war on crime, in the sense that cities were decaying, and then climate change, pandemic. The world has become what military strategists call one big threat environment. And the response is a security state. So our way collectively of warding off chaos is by acquiescing to a security state, to a surveillance state. And there are even more severe, rigid ways of responding to it, which move in directions toward fascism. People who are caught in the movement of trying to fix the world in a secure state often satellate an origin state where everything was a golden age, where everything was better, like the 1950s in the United States, before transgender people could speak in public and affirm their lives, for example. They want to ward off chaos by returning to that vision of the lost unity and the lost order. And to do that, they have to cut out of the social body everything that doesn't fit. They have to amputate people who are gender non-conforming. They have to amputate other races that maybe don't have the same form of sociality as white middle class America. And it becomes a disciplinary program of amputation, which is basically decimation, that becomes only more and more agitated and extreme as the world seems to refuse to want to fall back into the grooves that it was in before. And then it becomes, can move in explicitly fascist directions. So that's not just a question for our individual lives and how we live enrich or don't enrich our lives. It's a question for us collectively. And in a lot of parts of the world, we're at threshold where those mechanisms of warding off chaos in the name of supposedly lost unity have become extremely virulent, and that they're moving in fascistizing directions in many parts of the world. And that's something I think everyone needs to be concerned with, whatever your profession is.
So one of the consequences of this amputation and this this paranoia about chaos is what Aaron and I talked about, Foucault's concept of the docile body, that there's these social forces that are about surveillance that elicit paranoia, that they make the body docile. They domesticate the body. They make bodies that aren't capable of expressing the great intensities of being. Yeah. And we need that, eh? We fucking need that.
We
And I'm thinking about this in Parables of the Virtual. You talk about, I believe it's Parables of the Virtual. You talk about the stadium wave.
Oh yeah,
the stadium wave where there's a catalytic. Yeah. That's right. Architectures of the unforeseen. So you talk about the stadium wave, where there's a catalytic process, right? But in order for the catalytic process to happen, there needs to be an intensity that gets taken. And I'm talking about revolution here, right? It needs to be a catalyzing force that drives it, similar to how the stadium wave is driven from the affective intensities that are hard to localize on one individual, but sometimes you can. That's kind of the paradox.
Yeah. Yeah, we need them as much as we need to escape them. So it's a tension that's constitutive of the political. And one way of figuring that out is to think about different ways in which a norm can constitute itself. Because what we're talking about is keeping behavior within certain normative parameters. And in the older, more classical forms of power, a norm was a kind of idea of order or structure that was imposed, and then the body had to completely mold itself to. So it was a top-down operation. What Foucault was talking about in what you were describing, which is what he calls disciplinary body, or the production of docile bodies, the body is made to produce itself to meet the mold rather than mold being imposed on it to begin with. That's even more insidious because it's inscribing into your becoming toward those norms rather than simply externally putting a mold on you. So that it becomes part of your constitution. You have a body that is made literally to be docile, and your life as a result stays within certain parameters. The first kind he calls normation, which is norms just being imposed, like maybe in a monarchic court society or something. And the other he calls normalization, because once that little openness is made where the body is being made to fit the norm, there's more room for variation. And instead of having one idea of form, you have a curve. Now you have the familiar curve of the norm going up in the middle, the bell curve. But that means there's all kinds of things that are deviating from the norm along the sides. And it gets to the point that instead of having a sense of the norm in advance, and in the security state and what he calls biopower, the norm making is actually following movements in the population where the compass of what is normal changes with the variations happening in society. So 50 years ago, the norm did not include same-sex relationships. Now it does. So normalization can also be the production of new variations on the norm, or even new norms. And then going back to Simondon, he says, you can define a norm in relation to value. And usually you think of value as a system that pre-exists the norm, and the norm is there to bring it into the world and to regulate it and to protect it. But what he's saying is that you can think about it differently. You can think about value as the potential within a certain set of norms to change, to modulate itself. Value is its fullness with the potential that can move through it into next iteration. So instead of having this structure that clamps down between pre-given norms and values that they're in the service of and supposedly express, you have this process of emergence where you do have norms. You move through a certain ordering of society that allows it to have a certain homeostasis, what he calls a metastability, a stability within certain parameters, just like our body has a homeostasis. But at the same time, your notion of norm is returning you to the ability of that to mutate into a new expression where there are different qualities of existence possible, different forms of action, different forms of connecting between bodies. It's a process of emergence, and the key term is value and revaluing what value can mean.
Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking about the process of catalyzing that, Deleuze and Guattari were talking about their visionary approach. You talk about visionary embodiment. Um, their vision is a new earth and a new people, a new earth and a new people. And so, I'm in the business and in the project, and I think you are too, of catalyzing
Yeah.
bodies out of the docile body and into a glorious body, a glorious body that catalyzes, and kind of like creating a stadium wave
Exactly.
together. And it's like we do our best with the egg that we're in to create catalyzing forces that go out into the world and free bodies. And you say in this awesome quote of yours, and I think this is a great motto for the catalyzing wave: the rallying cry is always freedom. Freedom is not owned as a right. It is not consumed as a good. It is not chosen as an option. It is what is invented.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. You invented the SenseLab, and you talked about the SenseLab in one of your books, but also this 3 Ecologies project. And so this is your passion project together. And can you talk a little bit about what you're doing in this artful project, and how you put all this philosophy into
Catalysis is a word that I use a lot. I think it's a beautiful way of thinking about it, because when something catalyzes, it's because there's a whole set of relations in place, and then something small changes and the relations rearrange themselves around that little intervention. Aaron calls that a minor gesture. It's a kind of a hospitable way of thinking about making change. Instead of changing people's minds, giving them a new mold for their behavior, so what can I do that offers a catalyzing? And they're going to feel it happening, consciously or not, and they're going to go there or not go there. It's going to open options, possibilities that they'll follow or they won't follow. So you're prompting them to self-organize a change rather than changing them. So if you think of a collective project as operating in a relational field with its constraints and its affordances, then you can think in terms, what are the minor gestures? What are the little tweaks, little inductors that I can introduce that could inflect it in a more creative direction? And you can get more specific than that. It could be within a project where you have a certain idea of where you want to go. Like often we do a lot of work with philosophical concepts, and sometimes we want to take a philosophical concept and understand, how does that play out? How can we make that play out in real life? How can we make the thinking of this concept and reading and discussion living out of the concept in our interactions and in the world? So that's oriented in a certain way, but it's not pre-giving an outcome. It's setting in place an orientation as a lure for people to come together around, and then collectively they create their own minor gestures and tweaks that moves them collectively in a direction that they feel is going there. And so what happens if you do it like that? You don't have a leader telling people what to do. You don't have a committee making decisions, executive decisions. You have a self-organizing group that's inducing its own further self-organization. And what happens across individuals in the way their actions interrelate in that field, that tensional field that you have entered together and possibly constructed for that purpose. So what we did at the SenseLab was thinking, how do we construct a relational field at the intersection of art, philosophy, and activism that could bring people together around problems. Like the orientation would be problematic in the sense that it's posing a question that isn't yet answered. And in Deleuze's sense of problematic, it's the right solution doesn't pre-exist. It's creating its own solutions, and those cases of solution can be very different. It can vary. So you bring people together and say, what are the structurations in place? What are our habitual actions? What are the norms when we walk into a university space, for example, that immediately click into place? What are the hierarchies at play there? how are those hierarchies going to mean that the self-organization has difficulty taking off? What can we do to format the space, and especially format the movement across the threshold to the space, which is priming people's bodies for the kind of interaction to come, so that it opens into that experimental self-organizing process? How do we set in place? We can't do it by simply opening it up into an endless field of possibility, because then there's no reason to do anything. There's no tension. There's no constructive tension. So you have to set in place what we call enabling constraints to create the tensions that might lead in the direction that that the group wants to be moving in. And then you experiment. And it's much more like play than it is like work. It requires creative activity, so it has an element of the artistic in it. The aesthetic is always there because, as I said before, the potentials and the directionalities, we experience them on the level of global affective tonality or of atmospheres before we're able to parse them. We're kind of sourcing affective processes together, parsing when we need to, trying not to get stuck in any one parsing and structuration, keeping a kind of nimbleness in the interactions, and just moving forward like that. We did that for 20 years, creating a lot of what we call techniques for relation, which are not methods. Their point isn't how to problematize a situation, how to create those creative tensions, how to create that tensional field that's going to move into an emergence. And it was an amazing experience for me, and I think for Aaron and hopefully others. We did a lot of thinking. We did a lot of experimenting. We tested out a lot of techniques. And then we felt it had sort of come naturally to its own conclusion. When you focus on process and you have process-oriented techniques for keeping process going, you're always in a way fighting off product. You're trying to keep the process going, so you don't want it to fix itself in a particular end state, in a particular form. It's really invigorating. It really feels vital. And the affect is very affirmative and joyful. So you don't want to get stuck in product. It's like we were talking about before with the body and its organization of organs, its functional organization of organs and socially meaningful organization of organs, limiting what it can do affectively. It's the same with this group subject of the self-organizing collectivity. So we got really good at process, but then to maintain the process and its openness, maintain its openness to being tweaked, to be attuned to the environment so that things happening in the space, around the space, could potentially intervene as inductors of a shift, of a becoming, a kind of non-human contribution to the self-organizing. That puts you in a very kind of altered field, and it can be really hard for people outside to enter. It feels like there's a barrier, like people are speaking in code or a jargon. If you're uncharitable, you could think it looks like a cult. But it's just people basically exercising their freedom in the way I was defining it in that quote. It also means that it can be a testing ground for techniques that can be then taken and put in another context, like taken and put into an activist context where a certain kind of creativity and play is used to create potentials and to disarm the wrong kind of tensions. But it doesn't do anything explicitly. It's proto-political, but it doesn't do anything explicitly political on itself. We're operating all along according to what Deleuze and Guattari called the three ecologies: the social, conceptual, or psychic or subjective, that's the second one, and the environmental. And we worked, I think, very well between the social and the conceptual psychic in our psychic collective individuation terms. We weren't really addressing the environmental. And I come out of the environmental movement from way back, something I was always on my radar and I wanted to return to. And at a certain point, we felt that we wanted to really integrate the third ecology. So we shifted because of the SenseLab seeming to run itself out and the desire to want to connect with issues of climate change and the environment more explicitly. We shifted to the Three Ecologies project. And that involves a piece of land, very wild piece of woods with stream running through, off-grid, totally solar energy, in 3 hours north of Montreal, trying to survive the dark subarctic. Well, that's sort of exaggerating, but it's far enough north that the winters are extremely severe. Can be very gray, a lot of minus 40-degree nights. Trying to survive on that on wood and solar energy. But we had this collective platform. So our platform was now no longer the reformatted university or art space, or we often took it out into the city and it would be part of the public square. It was a forest. So we wanted to use that as a vector for reintroducing the environmental in relation to the social and the conceptual. So it's not a back to the land project, because what we want is what Simon Bell calls transductions between the city and the country, between the ecology of the city and the ecology of the forest. And those are sort of creative back and forths. It's not simply a relay of information, but there's that transmission of inductive gestures. So we have this place with two solar houses, a solar cabin, maple sugar producing facility. We're just building a greenhouse. And all the kinds of things we're doing at the SenseLab, we want to move here. But here the constraints are really very different, because they're less the kinds of social norming activities at the university, but they're the constraints of the forest itself, of the weather, the temperature, what the land needs to be regenerated, what the forest needs to regenerate after having been cut at various times of its history and to regain its full diversity. So those enabling constraints are much more set in place for us, but we still try to approach them in a way that tries to make what we're doing not feel just like work, it's not just play, but it's something sort of in between, that there's also can be creative edge or playfulness to it. And we have a cabin that people can come to, stay for free whenever they want if they're collaborating on the project. People come in a pretty continuous stream, and they do their artwork or their residencies or their academic work, and they participate in what's happening on the land. And then we have reading groups and other kinds of philosophical work, sometimes residencies around ideas. So it's a platform for relation that's land-based, but not back to the land. The land will soon go into a land trust devoted to experimental pedagogy and environmental regeneration. So we think of it as giving the land back to itself. And we want to try to create a robust enough little culture around it to sustain the land according to these priorities into the future.
Well, I hope I can bring my family someday up north there. We live in Silicon Valley, and we could we'd really enjoy a line of flight out of the.
That would be fantastic. There's, like I said, there's always a cabin left if we want something a little bit more comfortable. There's a guest house that we make a little bit of money to support the project on by renting, but we often block it off, or it's often free for collaborators to stay in. It's also a solar house, but it's more of a house than a wood cabin in the woods.
That sounds so lovely. I'm wondering, Brian, if we could orient to completion by kind of relating to the origins, which would be chaos, our discussion about chaos and how the unconscious is formulated and understood differently by Deleuze and Guattari, and that there's a productive relationship with chaos, that chaos is a motor of creativity, a motorless motor. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in my visionary somatics work and the kind of arts-based explorations I do is to try to find a way to ritualize chaos. And I'm wondering, because, Deleuze and Guattari, they were really interested in what madness can teach us, insofar as how it can inform the new earth and the new people. That there's something about madness and the chaos expressed by madness that can drive freedom, that can drive the taking off of the shackles of the docile body. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that. You've been steeped in this thought for longer than I have, and you must have explored chaos ritualistically and using arts processes, but it's not an easy thing to bring into a space because by nature, it's radically intense. So I'm just wondering, what you've learned about that. And this is something that I'm very interested in. I believe is very healing for people if it's done well, but it's hard to do.
I think it's extremely hard to do. I think you're right that it can be a really important part of therapeutic practice. We did often think of what we did as having a certain therapeutic edge in the sense of schizoanalysis. In other words, thinking through the effects of these schizos and what they could do to keep a collectivity moving affirmatively along its self-organizing path. It wasn't individual based, but it had an effect on individuals through what they set on through the collective's interaction. Obviously, it could go wrong. There are times of crisis, times of breakdown that we have to move through. Those were times of chaos. But as a whole, I think we always looked at ourselves one step out of chaos, because finding chaos was never a problem for the groups we were in. We were with the people attracted to what we're doing. And we don't advertise, we have a little website and a little Patreon site, but people basically are self-selecting. They find us through our writings or through word of mouth, through other projects that have relations with us, and they come. And we accept everyone. There's no membership, there's no vetting. Someone writes us, someone a couple of years ago said, well, we're just leaving Austin, we'll be there in 3 days. They had no idea where they were, but we welcomed them in 3 days. They arrived at 3 colleges and they were there. So people bring with them a certain chaos. They're often highly creative, highly neurodiverse. So they're often the kinds of people who are a bit in difficulty because of their connection to chaos, right? So what we do is take one step out of that, and we try to set in place conditions that allow for an open-endedness, but really trigger a certain kind of consistency, a coming together of people's actions and thoughts, so that all of us are moving differently, but together. That can sometimes, like one of the tools for doing that in art is writing a protocol. You set up a set of just step-by-step instructions, but they're structured in a way that piques curiosity, activates parts of people's experience that they might not usually bring into a situation of that kind, brings them to the verge of being aware that taking form could happen, but it doesn't say what that taking form is. So you set up a series of activities that is actually instructional, but opening to a kind of self-organizing. And that's sort of what we've always done, setting in place what we call enabling constraints, activating what we call techniques of relation. Within that, having particular activities that are conceived to bring people around according to to what attracts them. We also had an attractor approach, that we want to lure people into thinking and moving together, and to have that be organized in a very supple way that's open-ended, but then creates all these connections. Actually, it's all these affects that they can then, that might travel with them into other contexts. So we thought of it as a seed field. It's disseminatory. And when we were talking about therapeutic issues, looking at how schizoanalysis was practiced at Guattari's, the mental institution he worked in called La Barque, a few places around the world now where it's practiced explicitly as a practice of schizoanalysis. We try to stay really close to Guattari's intuition that what is being cared for, intended, is the relational field itself, is the relations between people, not the individual. And so there's never any sort of personal exploration of the past and trauma. It was always affirmatively oriented toward simply bypassing what blockages might be there, with giving little openings, little lines of escape that people could follow together, and that then might fold back into their everyday lives and change the tenor of what they do every day.
There's a principle of becoming that I know you and I share and Aaron shares, and it's called the becoming animal. And that there's a playful orientation to being in the world as an animal. And animals are really good at playing. Like wolf pups are generally better at playing than humans are, right? You just watch them and they just do play. And that's one of the things that, we just need to learn to play in that animal way and become animal. And with our children do this naturally, right? They become animal. You talk about becoming tiger, like a child can just become a tiger. They graft themselves onto the tiger, and the tiger can shapeshift. There can be rhythms and repetitions of the tiger. And, there's something so freeing about this and magical. Like, there's something that's lost in the therapeutic arts, and that's called magic, the magic of childhood, the magic of the animal, the magic of the imagination.
Yeah, definitely. And when it makes me, it makes me think of Deleuze's theory of the other. For him, other people talked about them as possible worlds. So they're not just people who are annoying, get in the way, and limit our freedom because we can't do whatever we want because of their presence. They're little affective worlds. They're like an example in the world of what you could be, how you can affect, how you can be affected, what qualities of movement you can embody, what qualities of relation you can connect into. So it's like seeing and being in relation to another person. Through them, you're in relation to this whole virtual world of potential. And as you think of that, and then think of animals, and expanding it to all the different kinds of affective worlds, different capabilities of feeling, moving, you're expanding that again. And you can affectively move into that and play with what that might give, expanding that little realm of the alien, because it is respecting the other as alien, but at the same time coming into relationship with it in an exploratory way. So there's becoming animal, but there could be becoming many other things. Which I even talk about becoming mineral, and it's a logic of affect. Like what becoming mineral wouldn't be literally becoming mineral; it would be embodying the rhythms and in the matter you have, the rhythms and rigidities and other qualities of the mineral as it might be translated into your body and into your matter. So you're creating yourself as an analog of it. And then that opens yourself to different experiences. So they all say that.
And I'm really excited.
They all say that in becoming animal, there's no animal become. It happens in between. It happens in that affective transfer.
And it doesn't have to be an actual animal. It can be a potential. It can be a concept. Like, for example, during this discussion, you said, you named this really wonderful concept, this really wonderful phrase. You said the parasite of language. And I'm thinking to myself, what would it be like for me to become the parasite of language? And like, I bet you if I came to the woods with y'all, you could let me just like become this parasite of language and just like embody it and play with it. And I am the parasite.
Well,
And you could be there laughing and saying, "Go, Dr. Tierney, go."
well, you're more than welcome to come. We would love to have you. But if you do, when you become a parasite of language, you're also going to have to talk to the animals. You're going to have to talk to the forest and the trees, because that's they're an integral part of our relationship. You're going to have to talk to our cats.
Yeah, exactly, right? Because the parasite of language is part of it's one of the prime drivers that is destroying the world. I think Deleuze said something like, opinion is the woe of our species, or something like that. Like that opinion is the motor of war and separation and separating us, ecocidal impulse and destroying the earth and all of that. But also nature does parasites too. So
yeah. And sometimes they become symbioses that create new species, like all of animal life created by a parasite that became the mitochondria. But,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, is there anything that you'd like to, as we wrap up here, is there anything that you'd like to pitch to our audience, or anything by way of closure you'd like to offer the audience
Well, I might
here?
just take up what you said about
Final
opinion.
gift.
And, the reason opinion has all the effects you mentioned is that it separates us out from others and asks, what is mine? What is my opinion? What are my values? And it cuts relation. It's an anti-relational posture. And language now in our society goes through social media and the internet. Social media is just one huge machinery of opinion. Does other things besides. But I think we need to think about that, and think about how, given our cultural conditions, given the movements, the incipient movements towards fascism we see in many countries, how we can interact and use our language otherwise to regenerate fields of relation that encompass differences, that make contrasts work together toward new outcomes rather than pitting themselves against each other, that synthesize tendencies and allow for a great deal of difference, but doesn't pit the differences against each other and doesn't simply tolerate them in a nice, liberal, polite way, but takes them seriously and takes them as challenges, because they do represent those other possible worlds that we can profit from by being in relationship with.
Well said. You talk about it in your writings as the worlding network. And I love this. I'm thinking about these different nodes in the worlding network sending off catalytic vibes, like a stadium wave, out into the world. And that stadium wave goes out to connect people in an enthusiasm about what we're capable of, what we can innovate together. And to me, that is the primary vision of the boundless body. That's what this podcast is about, the boundless body. I'm working within the World Wide Web network with you right now to do our best to kind of just put a shout out and put, hey, do you want to join the wave here, the stadium wave? Let's get the catalysis going. Let's catalyze, right? So we can thrive.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brian, so much for coming onto the show. I really appreciate it.
I really enjoyed it, and thank you for the invitation.
Really.
Thank you for listening to The Boundless Body. with the Somatic Doctor. Please leave a comment, subscribe, and like us on social media.
We're a swarm, we're a colony, we're a multiplicity.
Until next time, be well.